Where in the world is going to be the most important region for your national interest in the next 10, 20 years? Who's actually done their part for boosting the global economy? Actually, the successful advanced economies in the world today are the ones that send what they make over to East Asia. Those who think demographic dividend always does wonders need to rethink really what makes economies successful, stable, sustainable is a stock of productive, engaged, economically active women rather than angry young men. The fattest kid in school has just transformed the global economy.
Danny, was very interesting. It was good to hear perhaps some of the usual arguments and challenges you hear about doing business in Asia challenged and with some alternative evidence presented, which was really quite compelling and quite interesting.
I think it's an excellent session that it talks about how the west of the world, think about the emerging market, think about the eastern world.
For me, the most interesting point in this morning's the presentation is the per capita investment. That story is something I feel is we need to more pay attention to.
Is Asia sitting on a time bomb of overinvestment? This is per capita investment. So stepping away from investment per unit of GDP, look at investment per worker, investment per person. Has China overinvested? Is it overcapitalized relative to its workforce, relative to a workforce that can effectively use these machines? The answer has to be no. Not according to these numbers. China's investment per person is a tiny fraction of investment per person elsewhere in the world, notably in the advanced rich economies. Are workers in East Asia, in China, already faced with an excess of capital? The answer is no. These are three large risks that Asia faces. And for those of us, whether we live in Asia, as I do part of the time, or whether we sit here along the transatlantic axis as I do the rest of the time and look at Asia as providing possible opportunities, these are risks that we all need to worry about. These risks have potentially been overemphasized. They're too much of a presence in people's minds, in investors' minds, and that's holding us back. Is Asia overly dependent on exporting to the West? This picture that East Asia is the manufacturing warehouse for the world and then sends out stuff to the rest of the world, and that's the only reason Asia continues to grow, Asia is a high beta play, is just no longer correct. We can no longer say with a straight face that East Asia is a high beta play, it grows only because the West consumes. The third risk factor, the young people, old people risk factor. Old people are actually useful sources of productive knowledge for doing business, for doing economic activity. Perhaps the problem with the demography argument is not the old people, young people argument, but it's the young men, young women argument. Demographic dividend, demographic time bomb, yes, risk factor. But hey, there are lots of facets to that. And I don't find myself convinced that this risk factor is going to be overwhelming. But here's a new risk factor. Lots of Americans, lots of Westerners, lots of people living along the transatlantic axis that the German Marshall Foundation surveyed think that the rise of the East is a threat. Over 66% of Americans say that the rise of Asia, the rise of China, presents a threat to them, to the world, rather than say it's an opportunity for the world.
Given the Finn Standard Life investments, can I just ask you about Japan? And particularly the apparent support of the US for Abenomics? I'm just interested in the difference of importing and exporting components and finished goods, particularly in China, and if there's any of that is perhaps fogging some of the numbers.
Do you think the simple biggest threat to the world at the moment is fear?
The geopolitical reality is the fear and misunderstanding about the world could well force an outcome that will lead to huge parts of the world having to retrench, having to shrink, hundreds of millions thrown into unemployment, hundreds of millions of people pushed back into the deepest poverty, and with very little to show for it. That's a huge problem. It's not just a zero-sum game, it's a negative-sum game that the Americans might be playing at this point, the populist rhetoric pushing us through. So I agree with you completely. It's a huge danger.
What I would just like to say in conclusion, in thanking Danny enormously, is that the question about fear, the question about facts, the issue to do with understanding sits at the centre of what we are doing and will do in the future at the Age of Scotland Institute. In thanking Danny for talking to you, I would also like to thank again the Business School of the University of Edinburgh, and I would like to thank all of you for coming and participating in what has been a really interesting early morning session. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
As mentioned by the lecturer here, that today there is still some of the misunderstanding and the fear between the West and East. So this kind of the institutions, the Scotland and the East institutions, is just to narrow the gap.
This kind of dialect the communication is very vital and useful for the Scottish people to understand the real situation of the Asian countries.
We've been operating in Asia for over 10 years and increasingly do more and more business in Asia, and it's very important to us. So to have an opportunity to come and both hear somebody so learned and interesting as Danny, and indeed Gerard Lyons at a previous event, is very, very useful for us. It's great to get that insight, which you wouldn't normally get an opportunity to get, but also the discussion beforehand and afterwards with people who are in similar positions to SQA and doing business, and learning from each other and networking. It's very, very, very useful.